Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for one of Apereo's microconferences. My name is Patrick Masson. I'm the Executive Director of the Apereo Foundation, and I'm really excited by this event and the discussion today. I'll just quickly note we've had our highest registration ever, about 119, 120 folks have registered. So hopefully that means that this is a topic of interest. And while Josh might think this is just about people interested in him, I'm sure grants and funding are on all sorts of agendas for foundations today. So I think this is a very appropriate topic for our community and also generally just always something that's of interest needed around grants, funding, and so on. I just would like folks to know that all of these microconferences are available on the website listed there. There's about, I can't believe it, I just looked, it's 2 years of microconferences. And it's a real, not to be too boastful, but I think it's a real who's who of open source and higher education leaders and thought leaders. So it's well worth going back and reviewing some of those, and the link is there. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank our friends of Apereo members. Those donations are used to support events like this. And if you're not an Apereo member, I wouldn't be living up to my ED job description if I'm not encouraging you to join today. There's a link there as well. And while the events are growing, and this is, I think, our biggest one we might have had to date, please let other folks know that we're doing these. Also, if you're interested in a specific topic, please feel free to reach out to me at ed@apereo.org or community@apereo.org and make some suggestions. We'd love to make sure that these topics are relevant and timely for the open source and higher ed communities. A little housekeeping regarding the questions and answers. Josh will take the questions at the end, although if you have something that's really important, drop it, or you want sort of a clarification right away on, go ahead and drop it in the chat, and I can interrupt Josh and let him know that there's a hot question out in the audience that somebody would like addressed. Otherwise, he'll respond to the questions at the end. Feel free to drop them in it, and if I don't cover it or I miss it, I'll also be sure to review the chat as at the end so that we can get all those. So with that out of the way, I'd like to thank you again for attending the discussion today, valuing open source granting opportunities. And this is, I think, interesting almost as a gut check for us, because it's really putting Apereo's tools and processes out in front of the community as a resource for everyone to use and build on, but also give us a little feedback on, what are your thoughts? Does this work? Is better idea? Sort of keeping the open source granting tools open source so that people can use and contribute. And with that, I'd like to introduce Josh Barron. Josh is currently working with Apereo as our development officer, but he's actually the trifecta of holds a perfect sweet spot. He has experience in grants. He was with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, working as a program officer there. He has higher ed experience, where he was vice president for digital education at Marriage University. And he also was on several roles actually within open source communities, including the Sakai Foundation. So those three perspectives, I think, make him an ideal fit for Apereo, and I think that experience will also help relate to the projects out there, the other foundations on the line. Real quickly for us, and Apereo moving into this space, we never had a person dedicated to advancement or development within the organization. And I've looked at Josh's slides, and I can see myself in there as sort of the know-nothing expectation that let's get money tomorrow. And his role really helped to not only create the tools that you're going to hear about, but orient the organization so that it could best engage with funders, but also set expectations of what it's going to take to get this done. So I think that's another part of this presentation that's really going to be of interest on, yes, the tools are there, but there's other things besides that take place. to find success in granting and funding opportunities. So with that, I hope that I've introduced Josh well enough. If not, he'll tell me about that I missed some highlight from high school sports or something. I'd like to turn it over to Josh, and thank you all again for attending. Josh?
Thanks a lot, Patrick. I appreciate you not sharing all of those stories that that I wouldn't want everybody here to have background on. Let me also just start out by thanking you, Patrick, and the board, the Apereo Board of Directors, for kind of inviting me back into the Apereo community and serving as the development officer over the last year and a half. It's been really great to work with you again, Patrick, and it's been super awesome to reconnect with this really vibrant and innovative community. I'm actually going to start off today's session with a quick poll to get a little bit of a sense of the audience's background and experience with developing grant proposals and seeking grant funding. So if I've done this correctly, you should now have a box in the bottom right with the options there to select. And while you're voting or filling out your answers, I am going to give a shout out here to Big Blue Button, which, if you don't know, is an open source web conferencing platform, because I've just started to play with the poll tool, and it's really cool, including these smart slides, allows you to embed things right on your slides. So very nice addition there. Okay, I'm going to give you another second or two. Got some more voting, and then I'll publish the poll here and see what we have. All right, I'm going to publish the poll in the interest of time. So it looks like we have a pretty good split here in terms of experience levels. So if you're kind of on the lower, newer experience level with grant funding and seeking grant funding, that's good, because I've kind of geared the presentation for that audience. If you have more experience, though, that's fine too. And I would encourage you actually to put your thoughts, ideas, perspectives, funding resources you might be aware of in the chat as we go. We can kind of make this a bit of a collaborative learning experience. So let me move on here. So if you're on the newer side of this work, you might have the same kind of perspective and concept of what it's like to pursue grant funding as I had when I got started, which is now back 25, 30 years ago, which is, hey, it's kind of straightforward. A funder will kind of release a call for proposals. You'll write your proposal, you'll submit it, and then boom, you get your funding. And I'm sure everybody sees these types of press announcements coming out regularly. And so it looks like, hey, straightforward to go off and get your grant funded. Now, if you have a little bit more experience with this work, you probably know that the reality is a little bit different than that. And so I think, I find the work to be sometimes quite complex, can be very time consuming. Lots of effort goes into these grant proposals and so forth. Lots of twists and turns. It's not that straight path to get funded. And sometimes just as you're getting to that summit, you think you're about to get your grant proposal funded, you fall off a cliff and you kind of have to start over again, climbing up there. And Patrick and I have actually been through that here a little bit last year. And so today's session is really going to focus in on how I'll going about kind of assessing funding opportunities and really trying to identify the ones that will have the most likelihood of success in terms of getting funding for your project, your software, your community, and so forth, so that you're investing what I know is a very limited amount of time and resources that open source communities often have to pursue grants that, again, will have that biggest ROI on your time. So I'm going to start off introducing this funding prioritization framework that Patrick mentioned a few minutes ago. This is a tool that we've developed initially to be used internally at the foundation, but now are releasing it on an open license for everybody to, again, kind of go through this assessment of funding opportunities and really identify those that can maximize your return on investment of your time. I'm then going to take a little bit of a sidestep and talk about the differences between how private and public funders operate. Those differences tend to drive different approaches to doing the evaluation, and even in some cases learning about the funding opportunity in the first place. I'll then do a little bit of a quick case study on some funding that we're pursuing right now at the foundation to give you that kind of real world example of how this is applied and works. And then I'll wrap up by talking about some of the current trends that we're seeing, and I'm sure others here have seen them as well, in the open source software funding kind of sector, as well as some specific opportunities to maybe be aware of and assess against your own project you haven't already. I really want to make sure we have a good 10-15 minutes at the end for Q&A. I often find that getting your questions answered in this work is sometimes the most valuable. So I'll try to make sure we track time-wise and have a chunk there at the end. As Patrick mentioned, encourage everybody to put your questions in the chat as we go, and he can kind of collect those and moderate at the end. And if there's something time sensitive, we'll just answer those kind of in real time in the session. And then you'll see that I did put a little note here for those of you who are former Apereo members. We are going to open up the opportunity to set up kind of one-on-one consultations with me. So if you look at it, you're looking at a funding opportunity, you're trying to assess it, is it worth pursuing this one or not? You want me to help look at that, give you some feedback, you can reach out and do that. And of course, we'll be sending out these slides here in follow-up. All right, so 2 more poll questions, I promise. I just had fun with the poll tool, but this is a little bit to set context here for the first part of the session. So I'm curious how long people think, and I'll open up the poll now as I voice over a little bit. I'm wondering how much time do you think generally goes into creating a competitive National Science Foundation grant? If you're not in the States, you're outside the US, the National Science Foundation, NSF, is one of the largest government funding organizations in the States in terms of a federal national kind of funding group. So just wondering how much time people typically think goes into these. All right. Not everybody's voting. We'll have to, maybe I should have put a prize out here for voting, but okay, I'm going to publish the poll now. So let's see what the survey says. So that's interesting. It's actually pretty good response there to accuracy. I think generally 6 months is what people in this field would say. So 6 months of lead time. Looks like most people thought that. Some more is certainly can't hurt. And I would say generally it's maybe a team of 3 or 4 people from my experience, not working full time over 6 months, but certainly putting a big chunk of time over that period into this kind of work. And so one last poll question here. What do you think the percentage is in terms of proposals that the NSF accepts and funds in terms of all that effort you might be putting in there? This is getting, I can see what people are voting. I'll publish here in a second, but it's interesting to see where people are going here. All right, one more second. Your last vote's coming in here. Anyone else want to vote? We'll see a few more coming in. I'll publish the results here. So that's really interesting. It's about 25% actually. I looked up the data. It's interesting. People said 10%. It often feels like 10% as someone who's put a lot of NSF grants in. But I wanted to ask these questions to make the point that these are large investments of time and effort. If you're not going to put 6 months in, if you're 1 month, probably not even going to be maybe worth the time. But even when you're putting all the time in, only about a quarter of these get funded, and so you have to be ready for a good number of them to end up back getting funded. Again, a reason why you want to make sure that you're focusing and you're putting your time into proposals on ones that have the most likelihood of being funded. So let me move on and now talk about this framework that we've produced and some of the ways that we go about making that assessment and kind of maximizing your return on investment. So there's kind of 3 primary evaluation criteria that we've been using to kind of, again, look at these funding opportunities, decide if we're going to pursue putting a proposal together. I'm going to kind of spend a couple of minutes here just kind of explaining them and giving you an example for each one of these. So the first is alignment. Might sound pretty straightforward. And so you really want to make sure that your project, your community, the challenges you're trying to get resources to solve are really aligned with the funding opportunity itself. So the request for proposals, the actual funding they're putting, organization putting out, needs to really be matched very closely with what your needs are. And then the overall funding strategy of that organization that's putting the money out, you also want to make sure that you're aligned with that as well. So what does that mean? Let me give you an example. Maybe you are working in open source software and have some security vulnerabilities that you want to get addressed, and there's a funder that puts out a call for proposals to address security vulnerabilities. So you want to pursue pursue that, get some funding for maintainers, for example, come in and work on those security vulnerabilities. But the funder in this case is focused exclusively on funding science research software, and the software your community is working on is really math teaching and learning software. So you might have alignment with the actual funding opportunity, but the funder is probably not going to be super interested in funding your type of project. So unless you can find a way of morphing and positioning your math teaching and learning software as a way of supporting science research, which maybe you could, without that alignment, you might not want to put time into that particular proposal. Next criteria is around capability. So as we've talked about, it looks like some people have maybe experienced yourself. Some of these grant opportunities can be very complex things to go after, take lots of knowledge about putting budgets together, government processes and policies and so forth on federal funding. And so you really want to make sure that you have the capability or the capacity, excuse me, to pursue this effectively. So again, using that example, maybe you find a funder who is really interested in funding security vulnerabilities and open source math teaching and learning software. So there's a good alignment there, but you only have 3 weeks from the time you found out about this to when you need to submit it. And it requires a very complex budget to be produced. And you just have never worked on this kind of budget template before. And so that might be an area of challenge that you might want to deprioritize going after. But a way of addressing that might be seeking a partner. So maybe you can go out, maybe as a person in your community, maybe there's other organizations you work with who have expertise and knowledge and experience pursuing this particular kind of funding opportunity and these types of budgets. You can partner with them to bring that expertise in and then go after that, even though you only had kind of a 3-week time period. The last is around capability, and this is more about executing on the funding and the grant once you receive it. And so you really want to make sure that you have some confidence that with the funding you receive and the requirements and timelines of the funding that you're really going to be able to be successful with it. A lot of funders won't fund you again if you're not really successful the first time you get a grant from them. And so again, a quick example here. Again, maybe you found that great alignment, you have the capacity figured out to go after a funding opportunity, but they want you to address these security vulnerabilities in 6 months. And for technical reasons, it's going to take at least 12. That might be a situation where you don't want to pursue that funding, unless maybe you can, again, find some ways to partner with somebody, maybe accelerate some of the work. So again, these are kind of 3 primary criteria that we feel are really important when you're looking at a funding opportunity for the first time, and then trying to figure out, hey, should we really put time and effort in putting this proposal together? So I'm going to come back and show this here again. So if you don't grab the URL, no problem, it'll be in the slide deck. But these 3 evaluation criteria and a lot more details, and I'll have time to kind of go into today, are all part of this Apereo Foundation Open Source Software Grant Funding Prioritization Framework, which again, we've just released under a CC BY license. And so love to have people grab that, use that. We have also put out a kind of view-only Google Doc on it. So if you want to grab that and start iterating, changing it, updating it, obviously great to see that. Would love to hear back from people on feedback. We plan to release new versions of this on a pretty regular basis as we learn more and we start to build on it more. Okay, so let me move on here and talk a little bit about the difference between public and private funding organizations and how that drives different approaches in both learning about funding opportunities, but also going through this kind of evaluation and assessment process. I will note, having worked both here in the United States as well as other parts of the world, that some of these are potentially a little bit US specific or even regionally or even just funder specific things. But I will say, I think broadly, these concepts apply across all funding agencies I've worked with, at least around the world, in terms of public versus private. And the publics generally are using some form of tax dollars, public dollars, to fund this kind of work. So first, on the public agency side of things, one of the things that you've probably seen yourself is that these organizations tend to release what are called requests for proposals. Sometimes they're called solicitations, call for proposals, have slightly different names, but they tend to release these opportunities for receiving grant funding publicly. So they'll be on their website. They put them out far in advance. They'll make a lot of press releases about them, so everybody gets to learn about them publicly, and they probably have fairly broad criteria. They try to open up the criteria for going after participating in these grants pretty broadly, give everybody a chance to pursue them. They can be pretty complex submission processes and requirements. These are often government agencies. There can be a lot of bureaucracy. And so they can be, a little bit on the challenging side to navigate through actually how to put your submission in and the budgeting templates and the accounts you need and so forth. I think the third bullet might be particularly important from my experience. They tend to provide very limited direct feedback to you on your grant idea. So because they don't want to be seen as influencing and favoring any one person or organization, if you ask them, hey, I have this idea, does this align with what you want? Or what do you think about this concept in this grant proposal? They probably won't give you any direct feedback about it. They might give you some hints and signals here and there, but you're not going to really know from them directly if they think it's a good idea or not. And the fourth one here is just around how they review and select grant proposals to be funded. Most public funders will have some type of external group of experts they'll bring on. Panel reviews are sometimes called, and those will be largely staffed with people outside in the sector doing work who have expertise, but are not formally part of the funding organization itself. And they do that very intentionally so that the folks in the organization giving out the funding have very little direct influence under who actually gets selected in the final decisions about providing that funding. I'm going to go on here to the private one, but I'll just encourage people to put those questions in the chat as we go. And Patrick, if you see anything I should answer here as we go, just let me know. So on the private funding side, I should say there are certainly similarities between private and public funding, but I wanted to pull out some of the things that are most different and again affect how you might pursue and engage with assessing funding opportunities. So first is around how you learn about the funding in the first place. So most private funders do what are called invite-only RFPs. So they'll actually just send out the request proposal to a select number of organizations that they've been working with or know of or have relationship with to make them aware of the funding opportunity. That's not always the case. I've seen a Gates Foundation where I was, we did one or two public kind of RFPs, but in most cases, these are invite only. As private organizations, they tend to have a bit more streamlined processes, so it's not quite as complex. That varies a little bit on the size of the funding and how long the funding is. So going after a large multi-million-dollar, multi-year grant, it might be a little bit more work and effort. Smaller grants might just be a couple of pages of a kind of informal proposal. The third one here, as I said, with the publics, I think is also quite important. Private foundations generally actually give routine feedback and actually sometimes require it on draft proposals. So they'll often ask, hey, you have an interesting idea that we were chatting about at a meeting recently. Why don't you send me a short 2-page concept note, sometimes they're referred to, and I'll give you some feedback on that. And they'll actually iterate with you and go back and forth. By the time you're actually submitting your final proposal to them, you actually have a pretty good idea if they're interested and will fund it or not. So that's, I think, a major difference in how public and private funders end up operating. The last one is they tend to have more internal grant review processes. And so they'll have either their own staff will be reviewing the grant proposals and approving them. In cases where you're working with foundations that have living donors, they might directly be involved. So a little while ago, I was involved in a submitting a proposal to Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, and Michael and Susan Dell are actually reading those proposals in the later stages and part of that review process. So let me now come back to that framework and those three kind of areas of, or those three criteria for evaluating these grant opportunities, and talk a little bit about how they get applied again in this kind of different approaches that public and private funders take. So on the public side, that RFP that they put out, that request for proposal solicitation, that document can be super important in terms of doing your first evaluation, particularly in terms of that alignment as well as that capacity to go after that submission. And so you really want to take time to read that very carefully, kind of almost parse it word for word, to be looking for the critical things about, are you eligible for these? What are those budget requirements? What can you spend money on? What can't you spend money on? What are the requirements for submitting the proposal. Just to give you a little bit of a benchmark, the National Science Foundation submission guidelines, and the document that spells out all the things you need to do when you put your proposal together, is something like 275 pages long. And so it's very, very specific details. You really want to go through that RFP and those documents very carefully to look for that alignment, look to see if you have that capacity to go after that grant. The last thing you want to do is start putting in a bunch of time and effort, and 2/3 away putting everything together, find out you're not eligible or you can't meet some submission requirements with your resources and so forth. Excuse me. Public funders will almost always do informational webinars. So these will be public webinars. You can go, usually those associated or leading the grant funding opportunity, often referred to as program officers, will be the ones running these. And they'll give you a high level overview of the funding opportunity. Again, they're not going to tell you what is a good idea or a bad idea, but you can often read some tea leaves there on those informational webinars, because they will send certain signals. What they highlight on their slides, for example, will be an indication of the types of things they're most interested in. So those are really important to go to. You can often sometimes set up schedule one-on-one conversations with program officers, public funders. Again, they will give you some generalized feedback, but they're not going to tell you, hey, that's a good idea, or no, I wouldn't use that in your grant proposal. But it's still a good idea to connect with them. And then the last idea here I like to do is connect with prior grantees. As public funders, they must always publicly list out who has received grants in the past, often have contact information, and so you can reach out to those folks and see if you can maybe set up a conversation with them to get a little bit of a better sense of exactly what they've learned about the funding and so forth. On the private funder side, again, there's some similarities, but some big differences. And the biggest one being, you probably won't know about the RFP in the first place and even be able to therefore do an alignment assessment unless you've built some relationship with the private funder, because again, they're doing invite only RFPs. And so a good starting place, and this also helps with assessing alignment, is researching the funder, kind of straightforward, going to their website, reading blog posts, reading press releases, really doing this kind of desk research to kind of do some investigative work to figure out, what does this funder usually fund? What are some of the new things they're thinking of funding in the future, and so forth. Also here, connecting with prior grantees is really helpful. They often will also publish their prior grantees list, so reaching out to them is a good idea. The next step is really kind of building that relationship with the funder, which is a little bit more of an art than it is a science. I've been successful sometimes attending funder presentations. So unlike public funders that tend to not present publicly so much, private funders will often be at major conferences and present on various topics. So just hearing what they're presenting about gives you also a clue about what they're focused on, what their funding strategies are. Going to the session, meeting them afterwards, kind of getting their card is a good way of making a connection. Also just connecting with them on social media, or looking for colleagues that you know well who know them well, and try to get an introduction to them is a good strategy as well in terms of building that relationship with the funder. Again, both so that you get invited to submit a proposal for the RFP, but also all of this kind of legwork up front helps you understand the funder's funding strategy and look for that alignment between your work and what the funder is interested in funding. Last thing here is, ultimately, you probably want to try to get a meeting with the program officer at the private funder organization. Again, you probably need to build up that relationship first a bit. I do have this kind of note here that if you get a meeting with a program officer, you really want to go in super well prepared. Sometimes they're referred to as pitch decks, that comes out of the venture capital space as well. And so these are kind of short, concise presentations that really kind of focus in on the key things you think you want to kind of be pursuing a funding proposal with. And that's also another great way of getting some alignment evaluation, because as a private funder, they'll kind of go through that with you and be pretty quick to say, nah, that's not something we're interested in. Oh, wow, that concept on slide 3, that sounds really interesting. You'll leave that kind of meeting with a much better sense of where that alignment might be. So I'll wrap up here a little bit with this decision with the funding prioritization kind of framework here that share this decision matrix, which I think is pretty straightforward, but just a way of visualizing, I think, this iterative evaluation process that I think is really helpful to, again, assess whether it's worth pursuing a funding opportunity or not. So as you go and look across those three evaluation criteria of alignment, capacity, and capability, ultimately you're looking for yeses across all of those three categories. And if you get yeses across all three, then I prioritize this at a very kind of high level, put some real time and energy in pursuing that. If you get a no, a solid no, you've tried to find a partner to help you with capacity and you can't, or you've tried to find creative ways of aligning your project with the funder strategy, but you just can't do it. So you get a no in one of these categories. I would then really deprioritize that funding opportunity, or maybe just not pursue it at all. Maybe you look for doing it next year once you find a partner, that kind of thing. Generally, the first time or as you start this process, you end up with maybes. So generally, the first kind of effort you do to look at things, you're like, well, maybe there's alignment, maybe there's capacity. And then you have to go off and do some more research, talk with partners and so forth. So you want to keep iterating, keep evaluating these things until you hit a no, where you get all those yeses, and then you get some clarity prioritization. And I realize that this does take some time to do, in this kind of assessment does require some time itself. But again, I think that it's much better to do this kind of work up front, identify the opportunities that really are most likely to be successful and invest your time there, rather than just kind of putting a bunch of proposals in every time you see a potential opportunity cross your funding radar. So let me kind of wrap up here a little bit by talking about this case study that we're kind of actively pursuing right now at the foundation. And I'll kind of share with you the history about where we've been so far and kind of where we've are at this stage, to kind of outline how this framework and assessment process has worked, how we've used it ourselves. And so about a year ago, we began to look at the National Science Foundation pathways to enable open source ecosystems, the POSE funding opportunity, which many of you probably have seen, and it's been a lot of press around and so forth. And they have two phases: a phase one proposal that's $300,000 grants, and then a phase two, which is a 1.5 million grants over 2 years. And so we went through that at first: alignment, capacity, capability assessment, and ultimately spoke with the program officer, attended a couple of information sessions, and ultimately decided that it probably wasn't the right time for us to pursue a phase two proposal. Just wasn't the right alignment because they were looking for very early stage kind of projects that didn't have a group like Apereo behind them. But in doing that, we actually had the program officer encourage us to submit a proposal for a workshop, given our expertise and knowledge and experience at Apereo Foundation sustaining open source software. They were very interested in having us come in with our expertise and run a workshop to kind of better understand how to sustain research software, which is a specific area of funding focus for the NSF POSE program. And so we ended up partnering with Ithaca S&R, who has a lot of experience submitting these types of NSF proposals, also experience doing kind of convenings and workshops of this nature. They had also already received funding, Ithaca did, from the Sloan Foundation to do research on Sloan's academic OSPOs that have been funded over the last couple of years as well. And so as people may have seen, we just recently announced a newsletter that we've gotten that NSF workshop proposal funded. And at the same time, we've now gotten the Sloan Foundation has requested a proposal from us that we're working on right now with Ithaca to match some of that funding that NSF has provided, to give us additional flexibility and additional funds to run this workshop and produce some practical guides that we think will be useful for the community from that. And we've also gotten, Ithaca's received a partnership with us, a grant from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, CZI, that's specifically focused in helping support HBCU, historically Black college university faculty members attending the workshop. And so that this thing is a nice little case study here in how we've used this framework to identify, prioritize things. And it wasn't that we ended up not getting funding. It just helped us focus in on where it was most likely for us to get funding. Again, combining a public and private funding opportunities, which I think is a nice way of proceeding in terms of having flexibility that comes with the private funder, but having a public funder behind you as well. So hopefully that's helpful there. So I'll wrap up here and we'll have a good 10, 15 minutes here for Q&A. So again, put those questions here in the chat. But I'll wrap up with a little bit of an overview of some of the funding trends that we're seeing and opportunities that you might want to be tracking and evaluating yourself. So there's a lot of overlap between these four categories. And again, this group might be seeing some of these yourselves. One area that I think is very significant is around open infrastructure software. And I think things like Heartbleed and a bunch of other similar kinds of issues over the last decade or so have gotten funders, particularly I think public funders, to realize that we are reliant on open source software to run much of our digital national infrastructure at this point. And so investing in maintaining that open infrastructure is something that public dollars should be doing. And therefore, we're seeing more and more funding flow into this. Sovereign Tech Agency, which used to be called the Sovereign Tech Fund in the EU out of Berlin, is, I think, a good example of that kind of funding. We also have open source security vulnerabilities, obviously a lot of overlap here. But I think a lot of funders are starting to focus on that. NSF actually just recently released some new funding from the POSE program focused on addressing security vulnerabilities. So that's a good example of that one. The research open source software, I think there's just a realization as public funding starts to require releasing software that they're funding under open licenses, that helping researchers who generally don't come out of the pure software engineering, open source kind of field and background, helping them understand how to sustain open source software and mature it is an area of some importance for funding. And so the POSE program at NSF, a good example there of that kind of funding, as well as just open source software sustainability in general. Which I think cuts across all of these, but I think is been a topic for 20 years. I think it remains a topic today. Excuse me. And I have a little note here as a side thing that I don't mean to be a criticism at all, but just an observation that because there are funders now coming in to fund this kind of work who haven't funded it in the past or don't have a lot of experience, they don't have a lot of experience with open source software. And so I think some of the strategies, some of the things they're funding, their strategies are likely to mature as they learn about what's the most effective things and ways of funding sustaining and working and supporting open source software. So I would expect some of the strategies to kind of mature and change over the next several years. Also an opportunity for those with expertise in this area to help influence funders. And that's another kind of longer term strategy as you engage with funders, start building those relationships, your ability to really influence their funding strategy is something that you can kind of drive to some extent, a little bit more likely on the private funder side than the public funder side. So the last thing, resource here that I'm going to share, and then we'll move it. Well, actually, I'll share two here, then we'll move into some Q&A. One is this, or the last one here is a companion to the framework that I shared a minute ago, and that's really this funder tracker and prioritization tool. And so what you'll find there is a list of about 10 or 15 specific open source funding opportunities from around the world that we've been tracking for a while. So one, I think, resource this represents is just a way for people, if you're not looking at, don't know what some of the major funding opportunities are, this will give you a little bit of a head start there to be kind of tracking some of the larger funding opportunities out there. And then you'll also see that it can be used as this prioritization tool. So it might be a little hard to see on your screen, but there's columns for alignment, capacity, and capability, and then drops downs for you to kind of assign where you are in the work there. Yes, no, maybe, and so forth. So, and a place to take notes. So we've been using the same tool ourselves over the last year to kind of track things, monitor stuff, share across the foundation, the analysis of each one of these funding opportunities. So we thought we would kind of give you a blank slate to use to start with to do your own analysis against your own projects, because obviously you might be working in an area that we are not, and so you might have alignment on something that maybe we haven't. So you can go to that URL, use the QR code to get make a copy of that Google Doc on your own. All right, just checking one thing here. All right. And as promised, I'm just going to come back here for a sec. If folks weren't able to grab this URL and get access to this framework, I just want to make sure you have it again. And again, there's a lot more details than I've had time to go over here in the prioritization framework. So hopefully people grab that, disseminate it, share it, so forth. And then we do have that view-only version 2, where we'd love to get feedback on that as well. And we'll be iterating on this, releasing new versions on a fairly regular basis. So with that, let me shift now to more of our Q&A period. And we have about 15 minutes. And if you don't have questions, I'll torture you with more of me rambling about grant funding opportunities. So Patrick, what do we got here? I see 24 public chats. Hopefully that wasn't all mocking me or something here.
No, we start off with some questions. So if it's okay, I'll just go down the line, and first in line gets to go first. So the first from Karen: do you have any insight into the current status of NSF grants? I heard panels started meeting again, but I imagine there's a ton of uncertainty.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Yeah, I mean, I will be open with folks. I didn't directly address some of the things happening in the United States, federal funding, in part because there's so much uncertainty at the moment that anybody who's predicting exactly what's going to happen, I think, is probably just pretty much taking a wild guess. But on the NSF specific question, the understanding that I have from both what I've read as well as interactions with our program officer is that they are now back to releasing funding. Panels are reconvening at this point. And although they are, I actually should say for folks outside the United States, if you're not tracking some of the political situations here with federal funding dollars, Google that. I'm sure you'll get a lot of news stories. You can catch up on what's happening here. But back to the NSF question. And so they are going to go through a process of looking at the executive orders that have been issued and having to make sure that every grant is in line and following those executive orders. They're trying to do that in an expedited way and do it in a way that doesn't interfere with current grants that are underway or funding that's been approved to be released. But there's a lot of uncertainty there. I'll try to pull it up here and maybe put it in the chat. As we're talking, let's see if I can do two things at once, but yep, here it is. NSF has put out a website where you can go and track, or they're putting out public announcements about what the status of everything going on right now. I think that's really the best place to go to see exactly what's happening or what their current stance at NSF is.
All right, and I guess following up on a similar topic, Devin was asking, and just to sort of, if I can get the sense of the question here is do you think issues impacting federal grants might also impact private grants? An example was that a proposal was sent to Meta last year that had DEI specific to it, but after current executive orders, if private may decrease or maybe even increase opportunities related to activities happening at the federal level?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't have a very specific answer, except to say that I've seen a broad spectrum of responses from private funders. I've unfortunately seen a number, and I won't call people out here on this session, but I've seen a number of funders very quickly pivot to start removing diversity, equity, inclusion terminology, even though there is no legal reason, I'll say, to do that. The executive orders do not affect private organizations. It's only those that are receiving federal funding. Excuse me. On the other hand, I've also seen a number of private funders kind of double down and really strongly support things like DEI initiatives, and also signal very publicly and also privately that they're taking a firm stand and their approach to policies will not change. So I think we're seeing a kind of broad spectrum of responses. Best I can really say is to kind of watch things carefully and closely. Reach out to your program officers if you have relationships with private funders. They'll probably be direct with you about what they're hearing internally, and to whatever extent, and now I'm getting into my own opinions here, but opportunities to maybe influence some of those private funders a little bit by sharing your thoughts and perspectives is potentially an opportunity.
All right. Next, Joe's asking, do you use IRS Form 990 to research private foundations? If so, what info from these forms would be helpful? And I think this ties into a back channel question, somebody who wanted to not post on the public chat, but which was, how do you get the invite to the invite only RFPs? Or
So I'll start with the I-91. I'll come back to the anonymous question. So the I-90, again, for folks who are not in the States, aren't familiar with U.S. tax laws and things like that, the I-90 form is required under U.S. tax law for all nonprofit, not-for-profit organizations to release every year. And it doesn't have every single detail of your finances, but it gives largely the finances of the organization and where money is going. I definitely use I-90s when I'm looking at a private foundation, trying to get a sense of where some of their funding is going. But I will say that they tend to be very general categories, and so you can't distill too much. Sometimes you can, but in general, the I-90s give you some general trajectory of where some funding is going. But I tend to find that things like blog posts by the program officer, if they do those types of things, I'll give you a quick example. Patrick Methan, who's the director of post-secondary success at the Gates Foundation, he does a kind of monthly newsletter, maybe it's quarterly. And so, reading that gives you a lot of signals about what the Gates Foundation is kind of thinking about funding in the future. So that kind of stuff, I think, gives you a lot more insight. And then the other thing, a lot of private funders will put out kind of databases of all of their prior funding, and going in there and looking for patterns can be quite helpful as well. So you might find like, oh, they seem to fund things either at between $100,000 or less, and then between 100 and 500,000, and then between 500,000 and 1.5 million, but not over 1.5 million. So using database like that helps you get it, just as example, an idea of the ranges of funding that they tend to fund, and sometimes even what kinds of things they fund in those ranges. So again, just an example, but again, not saying you shouldn't use the I-90, but I think there's richer sources of information on private funders, sometimes publicly available. In terms of how do you get the invite, well, you can call me up and pay me lots of money and then I get you the invite. Just joking. It is this kind of art, and it's very much about relationship building. You could get critical of that in terms of, well, that's playing favorites and that there's bias there, and having worked at and gotten funding for private funders, that is a reality, I think, of how private funders work. And so the things I mentioned before are really what I would be focusing on is going to presentations of the funder, trying to work your network. You look to see, you go to the website, find out who the program officers are for that particular funding that you want to pursue. Then look that person up on LinkedIn. Maybe you have common connections with that person. Try to connect on LinkedIn. It does take some real groundwork to build up the first, just get that first introduction, then build up that relationship. But that's an investment, because that's then how you get invited for this kind of RFP and get that proposal. So again, not any equation I can give you to go off and get that invite. But I can say that if you invest the time to build that relationship up, more often than not, you'll get that invite, or discover that this just isn't the funding, the private funder is just not going to be aligned with the things you need. And then you know that you can put your time into engaging with somebody else.
Thanks, Josh. I'll say I added in the comment in the chat, but one of the lessons that Josh taught me was that I don't know if this is an appropriate way to say it, but friends fund friends, sort of like the success of an organization in finding funding with one funder helps to open doors for other funders, and maybe on completely different grants, but also when Josh mentioned the NSF grant that we just got, taking the success or the interest from NSF and including that in our pitch to other funders, I think carried some weight. And Josh, if you could talk a little bit about the other strategy that you introduced, was Apereo doesn't need to be the PI on all of these. There are opportunities to partner with those who are already funding grants, and Apereo can be a co-PI, or Apereo can be a service contractor that's identified in the grant for specific funding coming from the grant. So maybe talk a little bit about those opportunities.
Yeah, so I think, I'm a big proponent of partnerships at all work, but particularly going after and pursuing grant opportunities. And so I think, you could look at it as, I just want to try to get all the funding for my project and my work. But then you don't have the help and assistance of a broad network of other people, whether that is somebody that you're going to partner with that has relationship with a funder that will help you engage with that funder, private funder, or somebody who has more expertise on how to actually put this huge complex proposal together is another. One that I left out that I meant to mention is also just helping support other people's proposals. So through some of the work we were doing with POSE, we've actually gotten a chance to kind of be part of some other POSE proposals that are going in to support somebody else's work. So they're the primary person putting the proposal in, but then we're kind of a sub-grantee or a subcontractor under their proposal to support some of their work around open source sustainability. And so I think that's also a nice approach, because you're not having to put in as much effort on the proposal, but you're still part of it, get some funding. And I think more importantly, get to bring expertise from Apereo in this case into other open source projects that maybe we wouldn't be involved in otherwise.
All right, thank you. I do have another question, and it's on the private chat, and it starts off with, not sure if it's okay to ask, so I'll give you an ability to jump out. And you maybe you don't even know, but which private funders are still funding DEI? If you know, that was the question.
That's it. I will say there's funders that we've been working with at Apereo that have certainly signaled that they are not changing their policies and are very strong proponents of DEI. I think probably best for me not to name names at the moment. People want to reach out, maybe one-on-one, happy to talk more about it. But I would say that more private funders are pulling away from it than are doubling down on it from my conversations and what I know. That's not to say that that's true for everybody, or a blanket statement. It's just the ones that I know well and I've been engaging with. Have colleagues there. Some are more seem to be moving away from it than kind of doubling down. But we're also it's kind of early with all of this. It will be something to watch. I'm watching it carefully. I also think it's an area to influence stuff for people who have concern here. The more people, private funders hear about that, the more likely are they're going to maybe think twice about how they're going to approach things.
All right, thanks. That was the last questions in the chat, I think, unless I missed one. Let me know. We have a couple minutes left, maybe time for one more question. I see some folks typing. So I will stall by reminding folks that all of these presentations, including this one, are available on YouTube. You can get them there. Just a comment, thank you there. Also, if Apereo projects or members or even friends of Apereo, and not just the membership friends of Apereo, but friends across the community are interested, I'm sure Josh would be happy to provide a little bit more information on any specific topics. So I still see more people. They look like they're thanks. So we might thank you at this point. Okay, so no more questions coming in. Let me just add my thanks, Josh, for taking some time to share this. And also, again, invite anyone who's listening who does look at these resources. We'd love to get your feedback. By all means, use them as you will, with no expectations to give back, but or help up, contribute anything back. But if you do have ideas, we'd love to hear them. And Josh, any last thoughts before we turn off the recording?
No, Will, I will thank you, Patrick, and Apereo again for inviting me to participate in this session. It's been a lot of hard work over the last year and a half to put all this together. And I, as someone who's been super supportive of openness in general, it feels really good to be able to release this under a Creative Commons license, share it back out. And as you said, I'd really love to get feedback, new ideas, additions to this framework. Lots of folks out there have a lot of knowledge and experience in this work, so it'd be great to get that input and continue iterating on the framework. Great.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you all next month. And by all means, bring a friend to the next session.
Thanks a lot, everybody.